The rifle report cracked across the operations center before anyone could stop her, and Staff Sergeant Vance was already lunging for the weapon, shouting that she'd just wasted their last clean window. Corporal Marin Holt kept her cheek pressed to the stock, breathing through the recoil, watching the spotter's screen where the wind flags 2 miles out still hung in the brief lull she calculated would last another 4 seconds. The siege commander's voice cut through the crowded tactical operations center. Who authorized that shot? But Holt didn't move, because the target was still in the frame and the ballistic flight time was 3.2 seconds, and if the solution was wrong, the breach would succeed in the next 90 seconds and 16 soldiers in the compound would die. Vance's hand closed on her shoulder, pulling her back from the rifle, his face red under the lead panels that showed the siege perimeter collapsing into its final configuration, and someone behind her said, "She's gonna shake. She always shakes." The words landed in front of 12 witnesses. The TOC night shift, the senior sniper section, the fire support officer who'd been arguing for mortars, and the operations sergeant major who was already reaching for the comms handset to call higher. Holt had been reaching for the rifle when Vance blocked her, his bulk filling the space between her and the bench rest where the M2010 was still settling from the previous authorized engagement. A failure, because the approved shooter had missed the wind call by 2 meters at 1,400 yards and burned the only exposure they'd had in 6 hours. The siege had been grinding for 6 months, a fortified compound in the highlands where an enemy command cell had locked down supply routes and executed 3 relief attempts, and the intelligence cell had finally identified the cell leader's pattern. A single daily exposure, 30 seconds, on a ridgeline platform exactly 3,287 yards from the overwatch position. And the window was closing because the weather was shifting and the enemy engineers were finishing a tunnel that would end the siege in their favor. Vance had stepped in front of her when she'd pulled the dope book from her cargo pocket, the one with the taped wind brackets she'd built from a week of atmospheric data logging. And he'd said, "You're not taking this shot. Holt, you're a clerk. You're here to log fires, not execute them." She hadn't argued, because arguing had never changed anything in the 2 years since the training incident they all remembered. The stress shoot where her first shot had gone wide and the cadre had written questionable under pressure in her file, a line that followed her from the schoolhouse to the operational team where she'd been assigned as the precision fires data analyst. The person who built the range cards and logged the weather and kept the paper trail that nobody respected. She'd stepped back from the rifle, watching Vance take the position, watching him check the scope settings she'd already dialed, and she'd known from the cant of the bipod legs and the mirage boil on the spotter's feed that he was ignoring the vertical wind layer that split at 1,800 yards in this terrain. The shot had gone low and right, exactly as the math predicted, and the target had disappeared back into the hardened structure, and the countdown clock on the breach assessment, calculated by engineers who'd been monitoring the tunnel acoustic signature, had jumped from 2 hours to 90 seconds because the enemy had just confirmed the overwatch position was active and was now executing their endgame. The room had shifted into crisis mode, the fire support officer calling for immediate mortar fire, the ops major trying to reach the quick reaction force, the TOC watch officer updating the commander that the breach was imminent and the compound defense was down to its final magazine loadout. Holt had rechecked her dope card, the one she'd built with hand-logged wind samples every 6 hours for a week, the one that accounted for the 11,000-foot density altitude and the 15-degree cant angle and the spin drift that pushed .300 wind mag rounds right at extended range. The spotter's screen had flickered with a new thermal signature, the target re-exposed, this time for a mechanical check on the ridgeline platform that suggested the enemy was preparing a final coordination, and Vance had frozen, his hand hovering over the turret adjustments, his breath loud in the quiet room, because he knew he'd missed and didn't trust his next correction. Holt had moved without asking, sliding into the space beside the rifle as Vance hesitated, her hands finding the bench rest controls, her eye dropping to the kestrel clip to her plate carrier where the wind reading confirmed the lull she predicted was happening now, the atmospheric pressure spike and temperature inversion that would hold for another 20 seconds before the prevailing pattern reasserted. She'd touched the rifle and Vance had grabbed her shoulder, but she was already behind the optic, already reading the reticle hold, already sending the shot because the target was turning away and the window was collapsing and there was no time for permission. The rifle had bucked and the room had gone silent except for Vance's shouting. and now the siege commander was striding toward her, his face a mask of controlled fury, and the spotter was counting flight time in a voice that didn't expect a hit. The institutional weight landed on her immediately. The commander, Lieutenant Colonel Mercer, a man who'd run the siege coordination for 6 months and had survived 3 investigation boards for mission failures, pointed at her and said, "Who told you to fire?" His voice carried the clipped authority of someone who knew the answer and was building a case in real time. Holt released the rifle, her hands lifting away from the weapon in a gesture that was part compliance and part evidence that she wasn't fighting the hierarchy, and she said, "Target exposure, sir. 90-second breach window," which was accurate but insufficient because accuracy had never protected her before. Vance was already pulling her back from the firing line, his grip tight enough to leave marks. And someone behind her, the fire support lieutenant, a man who'd never seen combat but had opinions about everything, said, "She's not even a designated marksman. She's support. She logs data. This is why we have protocols." The room's attention split between the spotter's screen, where the thermal signature was still visible, and Holt, who was now standing 3 feet from the rifle with her hands at her sides, her face calm in a way that the room interpreted as either shock or indifference. The ops sergeant major stepped forward, his tablet in hand, already pulling up her training file, and he read aloud, "Operational Fires Analyst, graduated sniper basic with qualification but flagged for stress response variability. Current billet is administrative support to precision fire section." He looked up at her, his expression a mix of pity and irritation, and he added, "She's not on the shooter roster, sir. She's here to run the logbook and maintain the range cards." The weight of that statement pressed down on her, because it was true and also irrelevant, and she'd learned 2 years ago that explaining the irrelevance only made things worse. The training incident had been a stress shoot in high wind, her first shot missing by 6 inches at 600 yards, and the cadre had interpreted the miss as a no failure rather than a wind call error, and the flag had stuck. She'd been assigned to data work because data work was safe, and she'd spent 2 years building range cards that other shooters used, logging atmospheric conditions that other people interpreted, and watching shots fail because the shooters trusted their instincts over her math. The dope book in her cargo pocket contained 3 months of ballistic solutions for this exact target, solutions she'd refined every time the pattern appeared, and the taped wind bracket card, mocked by Vance as arts and crafts sniping, held the layered wind model that explained why shots at this range failed in the afternoon thermals but succeeded in the morning inversion. The spotter's voice cut through the room's murmur. "Flight time complete. No confirmation yet." The screen showed the ridgeline platform, the thermal signature still upright, and Holt's stomach tightened because the ballistic math was solid but the wind model was always a probability matrix, not a certainty, and if she'd misread the lull timing by even 3 seconds the shot would have drifted into the cliff face beside the target. Vance was breathing hard beside her, his hand still on her shoulder, and he said to the commander, "Sir, I had the shot." She interfered, "I recommend immediate removal from the TOC and a formal reprimand." The commander's eyes moved between Vance and Holt, and she could see him calculating. The mission failure that was still unfolding, the breach countdown that was still active, the political weight of punishing someone for an unauthorized shot versus the weight of explaining why he'd allowed chaos in his operations center. The recommendation toward reprimand was easy, because it restored order, and Holt had learned that order mattered more than outcomes and systems that were designed to avoid blame. The spotter was still watching the screen, his hand poised over the radio handset that would call the compound defense and warn them the breach was unstopped, and the fire support officer was already drafting the mortar-fire mission that would be too late and too scattered to stop a hardened target. Then the thermal signature on the spotter's screen collapsed. The figure on the ridgeline platform dropped sideways, the heat bloom fragmenting into scatter patterns that meant catastrophic tissue disruption, and the spotter's voice went flat. "Target down. Confirmed hit. No movement." The room froze, 12 sets of eyes snapping to the screen, and the silence stretched long enough that Holt could hear the ventilation system and the distant generator hum and the sound of Vance's breath catching in his throat. The siege commander stepped closer to the monitor, his hand reaching out to tap the screen as if he could verify the image by touch, and he said, "Confirm range and origin." The spotter checked his grid reference, His voice steady now. Origin this position. Range approximately 3,287 yards. Target profile matches primary HVT. The fire support officer was already pulling up the compound defense comms log, and his voice carried a different weight when he said, "Compound reports enemy assault element withdrawing. Breach attempt aborted. No friendly casualties." The room's pressure shifted, the crisis momentum bleeding away into confusion, because the siege had just ended in a way that wasn't supposed to be possible. A single shot at a range that exceeded the posted engagement limit by 800 yards, fired by someone who wasn't authorized to touch the weapon. The commander turned to face Holt, and his expression was no longer simple fury. It was calculation. He said, "You took a shot outside of IOE parameters, at a range we don't authorize, without clearance, in the middle of a coordinated fire plan." Each phrase was a formal charge, the kind that appeared in investigation paperwork, and Holt recognized the structure because she'd logged enough after-action reports to know how the institution translated battlefield success into administrative failure. She nodded once, a gesture that confirmed she understood the charges without agreeing to their framing. And she said, "Yes, sir." Vance stepped between them, his face flushed, his voice rising. "She got lucky, sir. That's all this is, a lucky shot. And if we let this stand, we're telling every support clerk they can ignore the chain of command and play hero." He gestured toward the rifle, toward the spotter's screen, his movements sharp and aggressive, and Holt recognized the desperation in his tone because he'd missed the shot and she'd made it, and the room had seen both events. The Ops Sergeant Major was typing rapidly on his tablet, already building the incident timeline, and Holt knew from experience that the timeline would matter more than the outcome because timelines determined who got blamed. The commander held up one hand, silencing Vance, and he looked at Holt with an expression she couldn't read. He said, "Where's your data for that shot?" It was a question that carried weight, because if she couldn't produce a rationale, the shot became reckless, and reckless meant criminal in a system that valued process. Holt reached for her cargo pocket, her movements slow and deliberate, and she pulled out the dope book and the taped wind bracket card, the tools Vance had mocked 90 seconds earlier. She held them out, not speaking, letting the pages and the handwritten wind layers and the ballistic coefficient speak for themselves. The commander took the dope book, flipping through pages dense with atmospheric data, wind speed matrices, and range calculations that stretched back 3 months. He stopped on the page marked for this morning's conditions. Temperature 42 degrees Fahrenheit, density altitude 11,200 feet, wind lull window 0847 to 0853 local, and his finger traced the final firing solution. Elevation 31.5 MOA, windage 4.2 MOA right, spin drift compensation 0.3 MOA. The numbers matched the shot Holt had just fired, and the timestamp on the page predated the engagement by 16 hours, which meant the solution had been pre-calculated, not improvised. The commander looked up at her, his expression shifting towards something that might have been respect or might have been irritation that she'd been right, and he said, "You built this when?" "Last night, sir," Holt said, when the weather forecast confirmed the inversion pattern. She kept her voice level, factual, because emotion was a trap in moments like this, and she added, "The wind lull was predictable within a 30-minute window, and the target pattern was consistent enough to pre-stage the solution." It was the kind of explanation that worked in engineering briefs, but rarely worked in command decisions, because commanders wanted confidence and clarity, not probability matrices. Vance made a sound that was half laugh, half snarl, and he said, "This is insane, sir. She's not qualified for this kind of engagement. She's a support clerk who took one lucky shot, and now she's presenting a math project like it's some kind of proof." He pointed at the dope book, his hand shaking slightly, and he added, "Half this data is guesswork, the other half is wishful thinking, and the only reason the target is down is because the universe decided to cooperate." The spotter, who'd been silent since confirming the hit, turned in his chair and said, "Staff Sergeant, the wind flags recorded on the feed match her bracket card within half a meter per second, and the shot impact is within 10 centimeters of the calculated hold." His tone was neutral, procedural, the kind of tone that delivered facts without judgment, and Vance's face went a deeper red because the spotter was a peer and the contradiction was public. The commander closed the dope book, his jaw tight, and he looked at the ops sergeant major. Pull the range recorder log. I want the timestamp on her shot and the inputs she used. The sergeant major nodded, already moving toward the bench where the tablet logged every trigger pull and scope adjustment, and Holt felt the institutional machinery beginning to process her, the gears of accountability turning to decide whether she was a problem or a solution. The commander turned back to her and said, "You're not moving from this room until I understand how this happened." The order was containment, not praise, and Holt nodded because she'd expected containment. The siege might have ended, but the institution's crisis was just beginning, because a support clerk had violated the engagement authority and succeeded where the approved shooter had failed, and the hierarchy couldn't tolerate that kind of chaos without reasserting control. The room's energy was shifting, the initial shock fading into the kind of whispered conversations that happened when people were deciding whose story to believe, and Holt could feel the social pressure tightening around her because the crowd wanted permission to reframe what they'd just seen. The ops sergeant major returned with the tablet, his face carefully neutral, and he handed it to the commander without comment. The commander scrolled through the log, his eyes moving rapidly over the entries that showed Holt scope adjustments, her wind input from the Kestrel, her trigger pull timestamp, and the spotter confirmation that followed 3.4 seconds later. The data was clean, procedural, the kind of evidence that couldn't be dismissed as luck or coincidence, and the commander's expression tightened because the evidence complicated the narrative he'd been building toward reprimand. Vance stepped closer, his voice lower now, almost pleading. "Sir, even if her math is solid, she violated protocol, and if we don't address that, we're setting a precedent that undermines the entire command structure." It was a procedural argument, the kind that worked in peacetime systems where protocol mattered more than outcomes, and Holt could see the commander weighing the institutional cost of validating her against the mission cost of punishing her. Before the commander could respond, the TOC radio crackled with a transmission from the compound defense. "Overwatch, this is compound actual, enemy leadership confirmed K, assault element in full retreat. We are securing the breach site, request immediate resupply and medevac for our wounded." The voice was hoarse, exhausted, the kind of voice that had been expecting to die 90 seconds earlier, and the room went silent because the transmission was proof that the siege had ended, not paused, and the cause was singular. The commander keyed the handset, his voice steady. "Compound actual, Overwatch confirms, resupply and medevac are inbound. Hold your position." He released the key and turned to face the room, his eyes moving across the TOC staff, the sniper section, the fire support team, and finally landing on Holt. He said, "This conversation is not over, but the mission takes priority. Sergeant Major, secure all recordings and data from this engagement. I want a complete package for review." The sergeant major nodded, already moving to collect the tablet, the dope book, the wind card, and the rifle itself, transforming the tools of success into evidence for investigation. Holt felt the shift immediately, the moment when success converted into threat, because the institution couldn't celebrate what it couldn't control. The commander pointed at her and said, "Corporal Holt, you're confined to this facility pending review. You don't talk to anyone about this engagement, and you don't touch another weapon until I say otherwise." The words were formal, the language of containment, and Holt understood that she traded the siege crisis for a new crisis, one where her competence was the problem. Vance's expression shifted towards something that might have been relief or vindication, and he said, "Sir, I recommend immediate removal from the TOC and formal charges for unauthorized engagement outside IOE parameters." The commander waved him off, his attention still on Holt, and he said, "Your recommendation is noted, Staff Sergeant, but I'm not making that call until I understand the full picture." It wasn't protection, it was delay, and Holt knew that delay could go either way depending on who reviewed the evidence and what story the institution needed to tell. The next 6 hours unfolded in a procedural blur. Holt was moved to a side office, not quite under guard but not free to leave, while the ops sergeant major compiled the evidence package, the shot recorder log, the spotter feed, the dope book, The wind card, the kestrel readings, and the timeline that showed her inputs, Vance's failure, and the breach countdown. The compound was being resupplied, the enemy retreat was being monitored, and higher command was being notified that the siege had ended through a precision engagement that exceeded standard parameters. Holt sat in the office, her hands folded on the table, and waited for the institution to decide her fate. The door opened and the commander entered, followed by a woman Holt didn't recognize. Older, wearing a clean uniform that suggested she'd come from higher headquarters, her collar showing the rank of full colonel and a patch that identified her as the Special Operations Command Senior Sniper Liaison. The commander gestured for Holt to stand, and she did, her posture automatic, and the colonel stepped forward with an expression that was professionally neutral. She said, "Corporal Holt, I'm Colonel Reyes. I've been sent to review this engagement." Her tone was flat, procedural, the kind of voice that delivered conclusions, not conversations. Holt nodded, saying nothing, because anything she said would be used to build a narrative, and she'd learned that silence was safer than explanation. Colonel Reyes set a tablet on the table, the screen showing the compiled evidence package, and she scrolled through it methodically. The shot log, the ballistic solution, the wind data, the spotter confirmation, the compound defense transmission. She stopped on the dope book entries, her finger tracing the 3 months of data that predated the engagement, and she looked up at Holt. "You built this solution library on your own initiative?" "Yes," Holt said. Target pattern was consistent, terrain was fixed, atmospheric data was available, so I ran the models. Reyes nodded, her expression unchanged, and she said, "Your training file says you're flagged for stress response variability, but your performance log shows consistent accuracy in live-fire data collection and range card validation." She tapped the screen, pulling up a comparison chart that Holt hadn't seen before. Her logged wind calls versus actual shot outcomes, her ballistic predictions versus measured impacts, her range cards versus ground truth. The correlation was tight, the kind of statistical alignment that suggested competence, not luck, and Reyes said, "Whoever flagged you for stress response didn't look at your work product." The statement landed like a reset, a reframing that didn't erase the flag but recontextualized it, and Holt felt something loosen in her chest because for the first time in 2 years someone with authority was reading the evidence instead of the narrative. Reyes turned to the commander and said, "Lieutenant Colonel, this engagement was tactically sound, ballistically valid, and outcome decisive. The ROE violation is noted, but the ROE itself was written for standard engagement profiles and didn't account for siege endgame geometry. Corporal Holt's solution worked because she built a model that your approved shooters didn't have." The commander's jaw tightened, and he said, "Colonel, with respect, we can't ignore the chain of command violation. If we validate this, we're telling every junior enlisted they can freelance." Reyes looked at him, her expression hardening slightly, and she said, "Lieutenant Colonel, the siege ended because someone executed a competent solution under a deadline your command structure couldn't meet. The violation is real, but the alternative was 16 casualties and a strategic loss. That's not freelancing, that's triage." She turned back to Holt, her voice shifting towards something that wasn't warmth but was closer to acknowledgement, and she said, "Your shot was the only causal interrupter in that timeline. The mortar mission would have been late, the QRF was blocked by terrain, and the compound defense was out of options. You read the physics correctly and executed under constraint no one else could solve." The room went silent, the weight of the reframes settling over the space, and Holt could feel the social pressure shifting because Reyes had just rewritten the story in front of witnesses. The commander's expression was unreadable, caught between relief that the mission had succeeded and frustration that his authority had been bypassed, and Vance, who'd been standing near the door, looked like he wanted to argue but couldn't find a procedural foothold. Reyes scrolled to the end of the evidence package, her fingers stopping on the range limit sign that had been photographed as part of the scene documentation. The sign read, "Max effective range, 2,500 yards. Our commander's approval required for extended engagement." And Reyes said, "This limit exists because most shooters can't reliably solve beyond it. But limits aren't laws of physics. They are risk management tools. and your data shows you understood the risk and mitigated it." She closed the tablet and looked at the commander. "I'm recommending no formal charges, but I'm also recommending Corporal Holt be transferred to a position where her competence is utilized instead of sidelined." The commander nodded slowly, his resistance fading under the weight of the senior officer's conclusion, and he said, "Understood, Colonel. I'll draft the transfer orders." It wasn't praise, it was procedure, and Holt understood that the institution was protecting itself by moving her out before the story became a problem. Reyes turned back to her, and her voice dropped slightly, the tone shifting towards something private. "You'll receive a sealed commendation, not a public award, because this engagement is going to be classified under operational security. The siege data, the target profile, and your ballistic solution are all being locked down. Officially, this didn't happen the way it happened." Holt absorbed the words, the final cost settling into place, because she'd known from the moment she touched the rifle that success would be contained, not celebrated. She said, "Understood." Reyes picked up the tablet, the evidence package now sealed behind access controls that would prevent the story from spreading, and she said, "The people in that compound are alive because you didn't wait for permission. That matters, even if no one can say it out loud." She nodded once, a gesture that was almost a salute, and then she left the room, the commander following, and Holt was alone with the knowledge that she'd been believed and buried in the same breath. The next 48 hours moved quickly. Transfer orders were cut, assigning Holt to a special operations training cadre where her data analysis skills would be used to build curriculum rather than support field operations. The TOC staff were briefed on operational security, the language carefully worded to imply the engagement was sensitive but not to explain why, and the witnesses were reminded that discussing classified operations was a violation of their clearances. The rifle was cleaned and logged, the dope book was filed into a secure archive, and the range limit sign remained on the wall, a symbol of the boundary she'd crossed and the system that had tried to stop her. Vance avoided her during the transfer process, his authority diminished by the public reframe that had exposed his failure and his misjudgment, and the few conversations they had were brief and procedural. The spotter, whose confirmation had been part of the evidence package, nodded to her once in the hallway, a gesture that acknowledged what had happened without violating the silence order, and Holt understood that some witnesses remembered even when the institution demanded forgetting. On her last day at the siege facility, Holt stood outside the TOC, watching the resupply helicopters landing at the compound in the distance, the siege perimeter now quiet and the enemy dispersed. The compound defense had sent a message through official channels, a formal thanks to Overwatch Elements for precision fire support, and Holt knew the message was meant for her even though her name would never appear in the record. She held the sealed envelope Reyes had given her, the commendation that would sit in a classified file and never be read by anyone who mattered, and she felt the weight of the cost, the silence, the transfer, the knowledge that her competence had been validated in private and erased in public. The transport truck arrived to move her to the new assignment, and Holt loaded her gear with the same calm efficiency she'd used to build the dope book, to log the wind data, to execute the shot. The driver glanced at her, curious about the transfer orders that had come through on a priority channel, and he said, "Heard you some kind of specialist." Holt looked at him, her expression neutral, and she said, "I do data work." The driver nodded, accepting the answer, and they drove away from the facility, the siege now a story that existed in sealed files and witness memory but not in official history. Holt watched the facility disappear in the side mirror, and she thought about the 16 soldiers in the compound who would go home because she'd read the physics correctly and acted when the institution had frozen. The system had punished her for saving them, but the system had also failed to stop her, and that failure was the only victory she needed. 3 months later, in the training cadre, Holt built curriculum modules on extended-range ballistics, wind modeling, and atmospheric data integration, and the students who used the materials didn't know where the models came from or why they worked. The dope book entries she created for the siege were adapted into training scenarios, the specifics stripped away but the methodology preserved, and somewhere in a classified archive, the evidence package waited for a future investigation or a historical review that might never come. The range limit sign remained on the TOC wall, a reminder that institutions built boundaries to manage risk and preserve order, and sometimes those boundaries had to be crossed by people who understood that physics didn't care about policy. Holt had crossed the boundary, paid the cost, and walked away with the knowledge that she'd been believed by the people who mattered and buried by the system that couldn't afford to admit it had been wrong. She carried that knowledge quietly, the way she carried everything else, without complaint, without display, with the same disciplined restraint that had been misread as weakness and was now understood, by those who'd seen the shot, as the strength the system had tried to suppress.